Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're exploring the life and legacy of a leader who quite literally drew the lines that shaped the United States as we know it. I'm talking about James Monroe, our fifth president. Now, he's just a fascinating figure. He came to the presidency as arguably one of the most qualified men to ever hold the office. We're talking a veteran of the Revolutionary War, the Continental Congress, the U.S. Senate, plus he served as a diplomat and a cabinet member. And during his presidency, from 1817 to 1825, Monroe drew some absolutely profound boundaries. We're talking literal borders on a map and figurative political boundaries that fundamentally transformed the nation and its place in the world.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Monroe's presidency is famously known as the era of good feelings. But, I want to challenge you to really consider the tension here. There's this highly optimistic surface, sure, but lying just beneath it are these incredibly deep, bubbling fractures. So was it truly an era of universal good feelings, or was it more of a precarious balancing act? As we unpack this history, you're going to see a nation shifting away from European affairs and turning inward to face some explosive domestic issues and rapid, sometimes pretty aggressive expansion.
Here's a quick roadmap for our explainer today. 1. The era of good feelings. 2. Acquiring Spanish Florida. 3. The Missouri Compromise. 4. The Monroe Doctrine. And 5. The legacy of James Monroe.
Section 1. Era of Good Feelings, a Facade of Unity.
So, immediately following the War of 1812, the United States had essentially declared victory. When Monroe took office in 1817, the national mood was just soaring. And fun fact, the era of good feelings wasn't just some historical label slopped on later, it was coined right at the time. Monroe actually went on this massive 15-week presidential tour through the northern states, kind of reviving a practice started by George Washington. And he was received so warmly that more Americans saw him on that trip than any other sitting president before. A Boston newspaper covering this unprecedented tour officially coined the phrase because the reception was just that incredible. The economy was booming and organized opposition was practically zero because the Federalist Party had largely faded away. With his affable personality and lack of pretension, Monroe was really reaching out to every corner of the country.
But, if we contrast that initial boom with what happened just 2 years later, we definitely start to see some cracks in the facade. The Panic of 1819 absolutely shattered that economic euphoria. This was actually the very first major financial crisis in the U.S. It led to devastatingly high unemployment, a massive spike in foreclosures, and widespread bankruptcies. It brought genuine ruin to everyday citizens. Naturally, Monroe faced fierce criticism for not responding more forcefully. But honestly, his hands were largely tied. He firmly believed these troubles were just natural growing pains for a maturing economy, and that things would eventually bounce back. That meant he had very little power to alleviate the severe, short-term suffering of the American people. Moving on to Section 2. Acquiring Spanish Florida. Expanding the borders. Let's move to 1817 and see how this builds. While the economy was fluctuating at home, the actual borders of the nation were under intense pressure. Seminole Indians were actively raiding American settlements right across the Spanish-Florida border. So in 1818, President Monroe sends General Andrew Jackson down there to put a stop to these raids. But Jackson, he took his rather vague instructions and interpreted them very liberally. He went completely rogue. He led his troops deep into Spanish-controlled territory and aggressively captured 2 Spanish forts. This wasn't just a minor border skirmish, this was a deep invasion, and it starkly exposed the absolute vulnerability of Spanish rule in that region.
Now, behind the scenes, we have a brilliant diplomatic architect at work, Secretary of State John Quincy Adams. Adams and Monroe didn't apologize for Jackson's aggressive military actions. Actually, scratch that. They leveraged them. They used this glaring exposure of Spain's weakness to apply massive diplomatic pressure. It was an incredibly bold maneuver, and it worked. They successfully forced Spain to sign the Adams-Onís Treaty, which officially sold Florida to the United States. Really, it was a masterclass in turning a potential military crisis into a huge, permanent territorial gain.
Section 3. The Missouri Compromise, a line in the sand.
From the physical borders of the South, we need to zoom back into the internal, domestic affairs of the nation. Because by 1820, a major crisis emerged that threatened to completely tear the United States apart from the inside out. It all centered on the delicate legislative balance in Congress between the North and the South. See, Missouri wanted to enter the Union as a slave state, and that threatened to tip the scales and completely destroy this equilibrium. To preserve the Union, Congress engineered this highly complex deal. Massachusetts allowed its northernmost counties to break off and become the Free State of Maine, while Missouri was admitted as a slave state. and Monroe played a massive role here. He used some very adroit backstage maneuvering to support the compromise, ensure it was constitutional, and ultimately sign the bill to avoid a devastating sectional crisis.
I really want you to look at this very specific number, 36 degrees, 30 minutes north latitude. This isn't just a map coordinate. This is the ultimate visual metaphor for the literal dividing of a nation. This line stretched across the remainder of the vast Louisiana Territory, and it became the definitive boundary drawn between freedom and slavery.
So the crucial point is how this single line functioned as the glue for a fracturing nation. The Missouri Compromise dictated that slavery would be forever prohibited above this 36-degree 30 line in the Louisiana Territory. This critical provision successfully held the country together for 34 years. It kept the peace until the Kansas-Nebraska Act repealed it in 1854. Monroe's compromise absolutely kept the Union intact, but the line itself physically mapped out the deep, unresolved moral divides of the entire country.
Section 4. The Monroe Doctrine, drawing a global boundary.
Having drawn a line across the American West, Monroe then turned his attention outward. Let's zoom all the way out to the global stage in 1823. At this point, the empires of the Old World were really eyeing the newly independent nations of the Americas. Spain's dominion in the Americas was completely disintegrating. Revolutions had brought independence to places like Mexico, Peru, Chile, Colombia, and Argentina. But European powers were threatening to form an alliance to help Spain take those domains back. In response, on December 2, 1823, Monroe delivered his 7th annual message to Congress. With some strong prodding from John Quincy Adams, he established these 3 major pillars. He boldly declared that the Western Hemisphere was completely closed to future European colonization, that the U.S. would stay out of internal European affairs, and most importantly, that any European interference in the Americas would be viewed as a direct threat to U.S. peace and safety.
Listen to the power in this direct quote from that address. The American continents are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers. And this brilliantly illustrates a massive shift in American foreign policy. With those words, Monroe put the nation on a completely independent course. The United States was no longer tied to the mast of European policy. It was boldly asserting itself as the protective power of the entire Western Hemisphere. This doctrine became a permanent cornerstone of American foreign policy, one that presidents would invoke for centuries to come.
Section 5. Legacy of James Monroe. The end of an era.
As we bring our explainer to a close, it's time to reflect on the lasting impact James Monroe had, not just on the presidency, but on the trajectory of the nation itself. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the company Monroe kept. He was the final American president of what we call the Virginia Dynasty. Think about it. Out of the first 5 men to hold the office, 4 hailed from Virginia. Monroe served as the absolute capstone to this founding era of American leadership. Well, he might not have been a Renaissance man like Jefferson. His overwhelming singular passion was just politics. His steady, thoughtful manner, his integrity, and his highly successful conduct of foreign policy undeniably strengthened the power of the presidency itself.
We want to leave you with this final provocative thought. James Monroe was a man of boundaries. He successfully secured Florida, he drew a bold line against European empires with the Monroe Doctrine, and he negotiated the delicate Missouri Compromise to maintain peace at home. But consider this. The lines drawn during this optimistic era of good feelings undeniably set the stage for the deeply rooted conflicts to come. Did his brilliant political maneuvering truly save the Union, or did the lines he drew in the sand merely delay the inevitable breaking point of the impending Civil War? It's a fascinating question to ponder as we look back at the lines that shaped America. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer.